what kind of tactical ideas are interesting and basic to understand that once you understand, you take early leaps in improvement?
Yeah, so it's things like forks, for example, where you attack two pieces at the same time, discovered attacks like checkmates, and again, winning like a queen or other material. Those are probably the two most important ones. Batteries or batteries and pins, things of that nature. Also
How
very
rich is the world of, and by the way, discovered attacks are when you move a piece.
And you put a king in check to win like a rook, for example, or other material.
And forking pieces is when you're attacking two pieces. So obviously the other person can't move two pieces at a time. They're going to have to lose one of them. Okay. So how big is the world, the universe of forks and discovered attacks? Like, I myself know, so there's like knights attacking like what is
They're forks knight attacking like a queen and a rook, for example, or like the pawn attacking a queen and a rook, or like a rook and a bishop. It's innumerable. But I will say that I think that with chess, the more of these patterns you see, the quicker you catch them. And that's how you improve, I think, the most is by learning these basic tactical themes at the beginner levels.
When you're discovering those patterns, are you looking at the chessboard, or are you looking at some like higher dimensional representation of the relative position of the pieces? So basically something that's disjoint of the particular absolute position of the piece, but like you're seeing patterns like this kind of pattern, but elsewhere on the board. Like,
Yeah,
are you thinking in patterns or in like absolute positions of the pieces?
Both. I think that at the higher levels, you're always thinking about like you're thinking about the patterns on one side of the board specifically, but then also what happens is you play more and more. If you're a very strong player, you will be able to remember, say, pawn structures where the pawns are on certain squares from games that you've played like 15, 20 years ago, even potentially. So it's a mix. I think a lot of it is more subconscious than actively thinking about it and like figuring it out like that. The only thing for me that I definitely am doing very frequently when I play is trying to look at my pieces. Are they placed on the optimal squares? Are there better squares? And then once I get past that, like using the basic logic, I start to think about, okay, what pure calculations, like what are the moves that make a lot of sense, and start calculating direct moves. But one of the most basic things that I think that I do that a lot of people actually should do that they don't do is looking at the piece placement and trying to figure out what pieces look like they're on good squares versus bad squares.
So am I, for each piece asking a question, am I in my happy place? Am I in my like optimally happy place?
Yeah, I think that's very important. Like if we look at this position on the board right now, this is a good example.
Who's not in their happy place on the board right now?
I think both sides are actually pretty happy right now. But the thing is, if you're playing with a black piece, there's what is a move that sticks out to you to like follow basic principles?
Basic principles probably bring out the bishop
And then castle the king.
and castle the king.
Right, exactly. That's correct. And that's what you should do. That's the best way to play the position. Now, once you do that, though...
By the way, I have a vibrating device inside of me right now, so I knew that.
Right.
And so my rating is 3,400, which is what I believe Stockfish is.
No, anyway. It's higher. It's like 3,800, actually.
Is it 38?
I think it is.
I'm using an earlier version of Stockfish. Okay. Anyway, sorry, you were saying...
So, like, that's very basic. But then, if you move the bishop out and you castle the king, let's just say bishop e7, play this, you castle. Okay, so now you've done everything with the pieces on the king side. So what would be the next set of what's the next way to try and develop the pieces?
So everything here is pretty strong, except maybe this pawn. I don't know.
Okay, but think about the pieces. So by pieces, I mean everything except the pawns.
Okay, except the pawns. Okay, probably either bishop or knight,
right,
on the other side.
Yeah, that is correct. You want to bring out the bishop and the knight. So let's say you go bishop to e6.
E6, yeah.
Yeah. I'll castle. Now you can move the knight to either square. It's somewhat irrelevant, but just move the knight. I'll just play it.
Knight to c6. What was your random move? Bringing the bishop out?
I just moved my rook to the center.
Okay, got it. Oh, well, yeah, what's your unhappy place
Okay,
right
so
now?
let me move the queen to just follow some basic principles. Okay, because I want to bring my rooks to the center of the board.
Yes.
So like in this position, you've pretty much developed all your pieces. There are only two pieces that you haven't brought into the game.
The queen
and the rook.
And the rook. And this you consider to be in the game because it was...
I wouldn't say it's in the game, but there isn't really a great square for that rook right now. Okay. But in this position, you would probably move your rook to c8, and then the middle game begins after that.
Got it. So here,
because now you've gotten your piece to all the optimal squares, and now you have to look for a specific plan, but you have gotten these pieces developed out of the opening. Yeah. And that's like a very basic thing that I think a lot of people don't think about is like, what are the optimal placements for the pieces?
So you're constantly thinking about the pieces that are not in their optimal placement as you're doing all the other kind of tactics and stuff like that.
But that's a basic thing that people can follow. Actually doing pure calculations, like moving 5 or 10 moves in your head, that's not realistic. But trying to use basic logic to figure out what pieces are on squares that look correct is something anybody can do.
What about looking at the other person's pieces and thinking about the optimal placement of them? Like, if you see a bunch of pieces not in their optimal placement for the opponent, what does that tell you?
I mean, that's a higher level concept, of course. That, like, I'm trying to give a beginner example. That is something that I do think about as well. Like, I try to think about my opponent's pieces. Like, that is basic logic. I think a lot of people these days at the upper levels of chess, they look at the game as something of pure calculation, and you lose that human element. You're trying to just calculate all these different sequences of moves, and you don't think about the basics. And it's something, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the next generation of kids who become very strong, because that is really how they approach the game. They learn with computers. Whereas, like, I learned with computers at a certain point, but I did not start off with computers from the get-go. So that human element still exists in my game. Actually, Magnus, I think, has said this too, where he did not use a computer, I think, until he was maybe like 11 years old, something around there. And so we have that human element to our game that I think the newer generation won't have. Now, it doesn't mean they aren't going to be better than us, but it's going to be a completely different approach.
What do you mean by human elements? Just basic logic versus raw calculation?
So it's like anybody now will use a computer from the time they start the game. And you use a computer, you look at the evaluations after the game to see how you're doing. But you don't really ever have those moments where it's you. Yeah. Or it's just you and your opponent. One thing that was great in the old days before computers simply became too strong is that you would actually do analysis with your opponent after the game. And that's very much this two humans analyzing a game. It's you and your opponent, two peers, and you come up with these human ideas. It's not automatically run back to your room, look with the computer, and, oh, I should have played this move, and it's just like winning the game. So that is kind of something that no longer exists in the game of chess because, as I said, there's no reason to analyze with your opponent after the game.
Are there ideas that the engine tells you that you can't reverse engineer with logic why that makes sense, and you start to just memorize it? That's good.
Yes. So in the opening, for sure, there's certain positions where moves are playable. And I can even give you an example, actually, in this knight, or if we can just set the position up a few moves earlier. Yeah, knight over on b8, bishop on c8, and just move the king back to the center, bishop back to f8, and pawn to e7. So the pawn in front of the king, just push it back 2 squares. So, like, here's an example. There's a move here that nowadays humans will play, which is this move pawn to h4. And this is a move that 20 years ago, if someone showed this move to Kasparov, he would just laugh at them. No matter who you were, he would basically say, you're an idiot. What is this move? Like, you're pushing a pawn on the edge of the board. It does nothing. Yeah. And this is something it's playable, but even if you were to ask me or any other top grandmaster why it's playable or why it's a move that makes sense, we wouldn't be able to say why it makes sense. Because it doesn't. We just know that it's fine because the computer says it's fine.
It's fine, or is it good? It's just fine.
It probably, like everything else, is equal with perfect play, but it definitely, if you're not careful with black, you can be worse, for sure. But if you ask me, I can't say why it's a good move. I can say, okay, maybe I'm going to expand on the king side. I'll push this pawn here and push the pawn forward. Maybe I can put the bishop on g5, and in some position the pawn guards the bishop. But I can't give like an actual good explanation for why it's a move that makes sense, because it doesn't make sense.
It's fascinating that young people today, kids these days, would probably do that move much more nonchalantly. You'll see that a lot more because they know it's safe, at least.
Right, because I know the computer says it's fine. But yeah. I grew up without computers, and so to me, it's you're pushing a pawn on the edge. It's the opening phase. You don't do things like this. It's just, it looks ridiculous. Now, of course, I have worked with computers long enough that I know, like, I'm not, I know that computers are, computers prove that everything is fine. But still, to me, it does feel wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think as computers get better, they'll also get better at explaining, which they currently don't do. at basically being able to do. So first of all, simple language generation. So a set of chess moves to language conversion, explaining to us dumb humans of why this is an interesting tactical idea. They currently don't do that. You're supposed to figure that out yourself. Like why, what's the deep wisdom in this particular pawn coming out in this kind of way?